Story 11 of the Fairy Ring. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Fairy Ring. Edited by Kate Douglas Wiggin and Nora Archibald Smith. Story 11. Lars, my lad. There was once a prince or a duke or something of that sort, but at any rate he belonged to a very grand family, and he would not stop at home, so he travelled all over the world, and wherever he went he was well liked, and was received in the best and gayest families, for he had no end of money. He made friends and acquaintances, as you may imagine, wherever he went, for he who has a well-filled trough is sure to fall in with pigs who want to have their fill. But he went on spending his money until he came to want, and at last his purse became so empty that he had not even a farthing left. And now there was an end to all his friends as well, for they behaved like the pigs when the trough was empty and he had no more to give them. They began to grunt and grin, and then they ran away in all directions. There he stood alone with a long face. Everybody had been so willing to help him get rid of his money, but nobody would help him without it, and so there was nothing for it but to trudge home and beg for crusts on the way. So late one evening he came to a great forest. He did not know where he should find a shelter for the night, but he went on looking and searching till he caught sight of an old tumble-down hut, which stood in the middle of some bushes. It was not exactly good enough for such a fine cavalier, but when you cannot get what you want, you must take what you can get. And since there was no help for it, he went into the hut. Not a living soul was to be seen. There was not even a stool to sit upon, but alongside the wall stood a big chest. What could there be inside that chest? If only there were some bits of mouldy bread in it. How nice they would taste! For you must know he had not had a single bit of food the whole day, and he was so hungry and his stomach so empty that it groaned with pain. He lifted the lid, but inside the chest was another chest, and inside that chest there was another, and so it went on, each one smaller than the other, until they became quite tiny boxes. The more there were, the harder he worked away, for there must be something very fine inside, he thought, since it was so well hidden. At last he came to a tiny little box, and in this box lay a bit of paper, and that was all he got for his trouble. It was very annoying, of course, but then he discovered there was something written on the paper, and when he looked at it he was just able to spell it out, although at first it looked somewhat difficult. "Lars, my lad." As he pronounced these words, something answered right in his ear. "What are master's orders?" He looked round, but he saw nobody. This was very funny, he thought, and so he read out the words once more. "Lars, my lad." And the answer came as before. "What are master's orders?" But he did not see anybody this time either. "If there is anybody about who hears what I say, then be kind enough to bring me something to eat," he said. And the next moment there stood a table laid out with all the best things one could think of. He set to work to eat and drink and had a proper meal. He had never enjoyed himself so much in all his life, he thought. When he had eaten all he could get down, he began to feel sleepy, and so he took out the paper again. "Lars, my lad." "What are master's orders?" "Well, you have given me food and drink, and now you must get me a bed to sleep in as well. But I want a really fine bed," he said, for you must know he was a little more bold now that his hunger was stayed. Well, there it stood, A bed so fine and dainty that even the king himself might covet it. Now this was all very well in its way, but when once you are well off you wish for still more, and he had no sooner got into bed than he began to think that the room was altogether too wretched for such a grand bed. So he took out the paper again. "Lars, my lad, what are master's orders?" "Since you are able to get me such food and such a bed here in the midst of the wild forest, I suppose you can manage to get me a better room, for you see I am accustomed to sleep in a palace with golden mirrors and draped walls and ornaments and comforts of all kinds," he said. Well, he had no sooner spoken the words than he found himself lying in the grandest chamber anybody had ever seen. Now he was comfortable, he thought, and felt quite satisfied as he turned his face to the wall and closed his eyes. But that was not all the grandeur, for when he woke up in the morning and looked round, he saw it was a big palace he had been sleeping in. One room led into the other, and wherever he went the place was full of all sorts of finery and luxuries, both on the walls and on the ceilings, and they glittered so much when the sun shone on them that he had to shade his eyes with his hand, so strong was the glare of gold and silver wherever he turned. He then happened to look out of the window. Good gracious, how grand it was! There was something else than pine forest and juniper bushes to look at, for there was the finest garden anyone could wish for, with splendid trees and roses of all kinds. But he could not see a single human being, or even a cat, and that, you know, was rather lonely, for otherwise he had everything so grand and had been set up as his own master again. So he took out the bit of paper. "Lars, my lad, what are master's orders?" "Well, now you have given me food and bed and a palace to live in, I intend to remain here, for I like the place," he said. "Yet I don't like to be quite by myself. I must have both lads and lasses whom I may order about to wait on me," he said. And there they were. There came servants and stewards and scullery maids and chambermaids of all sorts, and some came bowing and some courtesying. So now the Duke thought he was really satisfied. But no, it happened that there was a large palace on the other side of the forest, and there the king lived, who owned the forest and the great big fields around it. As he was walking up and down in his room, he happened to look out through the window and saw the new palace, where the golden weathercocks were swinging to and fro on the roof in the sunlight, dazzling his eyes. "This is very strange," he thought, and so he called his courtiers. They came rushing in and began bowing and scraping. "Do you see the palace over there?" said the king. They opened their eyes and began to stare. Yes, of course they saw it. "Who is that has dared to build such a palace on my grounds?" said the king. They bowed and they scraped with their feet, but they did not know anything about it. The king then called his generals and captains. They came, stood at attention, and presented arms. "Begone, soldiers and troopers," said the king, "and pull down the palace over there, and hang him who has built it. And don't lose any time about it." Well, they set off in great haste to arm themselves, and away they went. The drummers beat the skins of their drums, and the trumpeters blew their trumpets, and the other musicians played and blew as best they could, so that the Duke heard them long before he could see them. But he had heard this kind of noise before, and knew what it meant, so he took out his scrap of paper. "Lars, my lad, what are master's orders?" "There are soldiers coming here," he said, "and now you must provide me with soldiers and horses that I may have double as many as those over in the wood, and with sabres and pistols and guns and cannons, with all that belongs to them. But be quick about it." And no time was lost.